Okay, so I think I've established now that prepping is normal and that it's normal throughout history. And I think I've established what you need to think about before you start prepping as far as what you're prepping for. Now I want to start talking about prepping priorities. The first thing I want to talk about, I'm not going to invent the wheel here. If I can figure out how to link these things into the comments, I'll do so. There are people who have done really good videos on this on YouTube, and I don't want to steal their thunder. The first thing you want to think about is the rule of threes. The first thing the human body needs is you can only live without oxygen for about 3 minutes. So your first thing is an airway. But outside of a medical crisis or an accident or something, a tornado or something like that, the next thing you're going to be worrying about is you can live about 3 hours without shelter in weather extremes. Now I'm not talking about beautiful sunny 70-degree days. I'm talking about if you're cold and wet, or if you're in extreme heat without shade. You can only live about 3 hours without shelter, and that's a rough estimate. Your body condition and your situation is going to make that vary a bit, but it's just a way of organizing your priorities. You can go about 3 days without water, and you can go about 3 weeks without food. So this is going to give you a structured hierarchy for setting up your prepping priorities. The first thing probably is going to be medical, because if you've not got an airway, if you're in a tornado and you're injured and you're without oxygen, you got 3 minutes to restore that. So your first thing is going to be the CPR and the ability to restore an airway. The second thing, given that you're not in an accident or something of that sort, the second thing is you're going to be worrying about your shelter and your heat. So if you've got an airway, the next thing is to get yourself a tent or a tarp shelter or something of that sort and a fire. The third priority is to be able to get water and render it potable, because you can't store all the water you'll need. If a crisis goes on for any time at all, you're going to need water. The next thing you have to worry about once you've got your airway and your shelter and your fire and your water, the last thing you're going to worry about is food. So when you start buying things for prepping or making things for prepping, your MREs are going to be your bottom priority. Your first priority is that you've got the basic tools to make fire and shelter and get water. You're going to need some kind of a tarp, some kind of a knife, some kind of a tarp knife, a container that you can boil water in, some cordage, and something to light a fire with. Now, like I say, I'm not reinventing the wheel. That's Dave Canterbury's 5 C's and 10 C's, and I'll link them in here if I can figure out. And the rule of threes came from somebody else too, and I want to credit them properly as well. All I'm trying to do is give you a structure for priorities. Now, when it comes to shelter, and this is where I'm going with this, your first line of defense in shelter is not a tarp. Your first line is what's on your back. And this is going to be my area of expertise that I'm going to try to tap into and teach you basics of how to buy clothing and how to make clothing so that you're covered in a crisis. Because crisis isn't going to happen with a lot of warning sometimes. Crisis might happen when you're on the way home from your kid's doctor's appointment or the orthodontist, or it might hit when you're on your way to grandma's and 100 miles from home, and you've got to be, as a Sigma-3 survival guy say, if you're not always prepared, you're never prepared. So I want to try to show you how to always have clothing on you or in the car that you can rely on in a crisis. And if a crisis goes on for a long enough time that you wear out your clothing or your kids outgrow it, how to make some more clothing. And if you're prepping, folks, something to think about, okay? I'm laying it out real bluntly here. In a long-term crisis, there's not going to be services that you're used to like birth control or doctors. And you better be thinking about, unless you're planning on being celibate for however long a crisis lasts, you may have children you didn't have at the start. And even if you did have the children at the start, they're going to grow. So you better be prepared to be able to make more clothing if you don't have the ability to buy more clothing. Crises sometimes go on for years, so it's better to plan ahead.